It's Marie McInerney here at the very end of the day at the Strengthening Disability Advocacy Conference, and I'm talking to our MC for the day, Julie Phillips, who is very well known in the disability advocacy community in Victoria. You've been working for 20 years or so in it. Can you just give us a little bit of a background about your current roles and what brought you here today, really?
Well, I'm the manager of the Disability Discrimination Legal Service, so that's how I've come here today, and my role as a board member on the Disability Advocacy Victoria is we were one of the partners for planning the conference. My other hat is as a disability advocate who assists people with disabilities to make complaints of discrimination. That's probably the job that takes up most of my time, and I specialise in kids with disabilities and their access to education. So I was asked to come here today to MC, which I was pretty happy about, because it's always great to spend a day with my comrades, so to speak.
Yeah, that's the whole thing you said. It's so rare for people to be able to come in the room together. You also made the important point that there are many people with disability who aren't here. Did you want to talk about that, perhaps to start with, if we acknowledge, who can't come to these?
Yeah, look, it always bothers me when I think about people with disabilities who have perhaps moderate to severe complex disabilities that don't have any of the opportunities that we had today, including people with disabilities in the room. And I think they're almost the forgotten sub-community, if you like, of people with disabilities, because they are literally not seen and they are literally not heard, and therefore they tend to be a bit ignored, because when you listen to the higher level discussions at conferences today, which are great, but we're talking about things like using the correct language and terminology and the importance of those finer points, when to this group they often can't even communicate. They wouldn't know the conference was on. They are often absolutely marginalised, and they are vulnerable. I know many people with disabilities don't like to be perceived as vulnerable, but when you can't communicate at all and you can barely move, you absolutely are vulnerable. So it does bother me, although I don't have the solution, so to speak, that group cannot attend conferences such as this, and I think we really need to think about that.
Yes, it's the layers of privilege, isn't it, that they are many-faceted. What, therefore, let's talk sort of the people in the room, what do you think were the main points that arose today? What took you by surprise, or what made you worried, or what made you feel relieved? What were the take-homes for you, particularly as a disability advocate veteran? And then perhaps what do you think should be the take-home for mainstream Australia? Because we're many of us in the room, but there's a broader message, isn't there?
I wasn't surprised at anything, unfortunately, and I wasn't even surprised that we're still talking about the same things today as we talked about 5 years ago and we talked about 10 years ago. I'm disappointed.
What sort of things were they?
Well, the sorts of things like segregation, violence, the simple rights that the rest of the community have that people with disabilities still don't have. The fact that people with disabilities still can't get the police to take them seriously when they report a crime. The fact that there continues to be significant violence against students with disabilities in schools and that nothing is done about it. These are the sorts of issues that many of us have been banging on about for some of us for decades, some of us for just years, and we are still discussing them. I think it's actually nice to see some younger activists coming through and diverting us from some of those more basic problems to some of the finer issues, to make sure that we recognise, intersex couples and, the sorts of questions that the rest of the community have about acceptance of gay and lesbian and bisexual people. It's great that the conversation is now getting into those sorts of areas as well. But it's a worry, I guess, that we still can't seem to resolve some of the more basic issues. So that is disappointing. The other terrific thing about it is to be able to share with each other and see each other. And I don't mean that in a kumbaya type of way, but I think it's actually really empowering and comforting to be able to talk with your comrades about the things that we are doing that we should be doing better, and try and take home the message that we probably need to collaborate a little bit more to be effective. I think somebody was talking about the fact that we're underfunded and we're isolated and we're often competing against each other for funding, and someone said, well, I think that's the way the government likes it, and I'm sure that's true, and it's been a very successful strategy because we are a bit disparate. We don't come together and work together as well as we could. So they're some of my thoughts about the conference. In terms of mainstream people and the community and being able to transfer some of the things that we're talking about out, I think it would be great if people who are not involved in the sector at all could attend today. And of course they could, but they're naturally not going to. And I think for people without disabilities and who don't have an interest in the sector to meet those who do, I think it is one of the best ways to break down barriers, because a lot of people without disabilities operate from a level of ignorance. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way, I mean that in its purest sense. And fear about approaching people with disabilities, and they might be so different because they don't really appreciate that they're just the same as everybody else. And so I think that we also have to think about ways to involve the mainstream community and make connections, so we're not all advocating the same small group advocating for issues which I'm sure many mainstream community members would be interested in supporting us if they knew or understood about them.
I think the thing about this, and it gets me every time I come to this conference, is it's in many ways the way they put it together. We saw some amazing films. It's also in just hearing people's personal stories. What was the most powerful moment for you from it, or powerful moments?
Oh gosh, look, it's easy to answer that one. It was the preview of the documentary about Defiant Lives, and the cruelty meted out to people with disabilities, the absolute cruelty by governments and well-meaning nurses and doctors and social workers. It's torture really, isn't it? Shackling people to beds, leaving them on their own all day, every day, locking them up. The photos that we saw, the interviews, brief interviews we heard of people recounting their experiences, which were only a few decades ago. That was very upsetting for everyone in the room, because those of us that didn't live it have heard about it, but when you see it, it's a different story. And I think that we ought to not forget that, and that we probably need to concentrate our efforts on kids with disabilities in schools who are still being locked up, tied up, dragged around, and that sort of behaviour seems to have the imprimatur of many departments of education. So, when it's funny, because you've got on one hand people discussing what type of language should we use about, the term safeguarding, should we use this other term, and then you've got the complete other end of the scale when we've still got people with disabilities being, violently assaulted in the places that are meant to be protecting them and teaching them. So what an array of issues to deal with.
The schools issue has been a huge one, I think, today and yesterday, and just the pain of families in not being able to assert the right that they have for their child to be educated. Well, that's a lot of your work now, isn't it? Can you perhaps discuss any of the cases, or where New South Wales has had a huge focus on it recently. Are we getting anywhere?
Look, there's a lot of froth and bubble around, particularly in Victoria, because there's been a very strong movement there. The heat has been on the government. But when you are intimately involved in those areas and you continue to hear government and their lawyers speak about what they've done and what they're doing and defend it vigorously, you begin to realise that there isn't anything happening. So you might have meetings and you might have reviews and you might have change of policy, but then when it comes down to what the department's actual views are on kids with disabilities, whether they should be treated humanely, whether they should be educated, the evidence that I see is that it is exactly the same as it was 10 years ago and 20 years ago. And when you have ministers for education approving schools that admit that they've got cages in their classroom in 2016, you get very disheartened about where we're going. So I think that is an issue. So there again, a huge spectrum. On one hand, you've got how can we stop teachers being violent and aides being violent towards students with disabilities, and then you've got how do we get them educated, so and everything in between. But obviously education is the gateway to everyone's lives, whether they're going to work, if they're going to live in poverty. You know, there's nothing more important than being able to get jobs, feel you can be involved in community on an equal level, have the money to perhaps make choices of your own. People with disabilities still, many of them will never be able to do that because they just can't get an education or, again, communication. So from my perspective, it's one of the most important issues because of how much it shapes a person's life. And again, we had a few parents here today, but children, you know, their issues are underrepresented today, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So that's a very distressing issue still. Mm-hmm. So not to end on a not strengths-based perspective, you're in the room with Malcolm Turnbull. What's the one thing you'd ask him to do?
Only one. I don't know how I would, I don't know how to pick one. I think the Disability Discrimination Act is a very poor act. I think the Disability Standards for Education as part of that act is an even worse piece of legislation. If we assume that people without disabilities, employers, principals, government, are going to continue their lack of interest in the welfare of people with disabilities for the foreseeable future, that we then have to concentrate on our enforcement of when those people are discriminated against, and our enforcement tools and their processes and their systems are very weak and they're very inaccessible. If you want to use the Disability Discrimination Act, you've got to be at risk of perhaps losing everything you own. It's not accessible. So I think, as a person who probably uses that tool, that I would ask him to set up a group comprising mostly people with disabilities to advise him on how to change that act and agree on their recommendations, no matter what they were.
That sounds a great takeaway. Thank you so much, Julie. Really appreciate it. It was a great day. Well done with the emceeing.
Thank you.